1991, more than 30,000 people were knowingly infected with HIV or hepatitis C in contaminated blood products, leading to around 3,000 deaths. Sir Brian Longstaff's report found that patients were experimented on by doctors and not told of the risks, sometimes for years. He also found that infected patients were cruelly told that they had received the best treatment. Well, Sir Brian said successive governments, the NHS and the medical profession repeatedly used inaccurate, misleading and defensive lines about the scandal. And he said there was downright deception from officials from the Department of Health, with some documents deliberately destroyed and others going missing. Sir Brian concluded that responsibility lies with successive governments whose failures compounded the suffering of victims. Our first report is from our health correspondent, Ashish Joshi.
This is how much it means to be listened to and to be believed. After decades of being lied to and gaslit, finally, vindication. The infected blood scandal could and should have been avoided. Its victims were betrayed.
The report details how 3 lines were repeatedly deployed by successive governments. That people had the best available treatment, that the infections were inadvertent, and that screening for hepatitis C could not have been introduced earlier than September 1991. All of those claims were untrue.
The damning 2,500-page report makes for grim reading. Secret trials and experiments, and the deliberate destroying of key documents in a perversive cover-up.
Definitely crimes were committed against children here.
The horror inside Treloar's school is laid bare, where haemophiliac pupils were regarded as objects of research rather than children. Aid Goodyear was one of these children, infected with HIV and hepatitis C.
It was always maintained at Treloar's, but the doctors couldn't possibly have known. They couldn't possibly have seen this coming. And they knew from the very first injections of factor-8 and factor 9. We're not liars no more. We're not liars no more. We won't have people now saying, really? No one would do that to children. But they did, and continually did it to children.
Successive governments were blamed for years of delay and denial, attempts to avoid paying compensation. That will be addressed later this week. First, the apology they have waited for so long, a recognition of their suffering and pain.
This is a day of shame for the British state. Today's report shows a decades-long moral failure at the heart of our national life. From the National Health Service to the civil service, to ministers in successive governments, at every level, the people and institutions in which we place our trust failed in the most harrowing and devastating way.
You got stomachache?
But that apology has come too late for the parents of Lee Turton. Lee was infected with HIV during his treatment for haemophilia. He died when he was just 10 years old.
An apology should have been given when it happened. It's too little too late now. It's there in black and white that this shouldn't have happened. Lee should still be here. He lost everything.
Denise told me she has found today hard and has left her feeling numb. Many here will share that emotion. In the introduction to his report, Sir Brian Longstaff warns that readers will find it hard to believe that a scandal like this could have been allowed to happen here in the UK. But it did, and people are still suffering because of it. It is impossible to right those wrongs, but now is the time to try. Ashish Joshi, Sky News, at the Blood Inquiry.
And we're going to hear from Ashish again a little later in the programme. But first, our chief North of England correspondent, Greg Milam, has been speaking to one survivor from Bridlington in Yorkshire. Mel Mackay was infected by contaminated blood as a 5-year-old child.
God, I'm shaking now. because reality just kicked in.
It has been a long wait for Mel Mackay.
Oh gosh, there's loads of pages. I don't even know where to start.
Reading what she and so many thousands have known all along.
He's put, I have to report a catalogue of failures.
Finally, official recognition of how they were failed.
Systemic, collective and individual failures.
Mel was 5 years old when she was given a transfusion of infected blood during surgery. It left her with HIV and changed the course of her life.
Having HIV affected my life hugely. I've not been able to fulfil my dreams or aspirations in becoming a paediatric nurse, but also I've not been able to fulfil having a relationship or having a family of my own. I'm angry that the failings that happened where it should have never happened. I'm also relieved that we've finally got the answers that we've been waiting for, but also sad for the ones that are not here today to see justice, which, in a sense, breaks my heart.
Among them, her mum, who died in March.
One of the last things she said to me, I'm so, so proud of you for what you have done and what you have become. She was really proud of me, and that was special because it meant a lot.
She says whatever the complexities, the compensation now has to reach everyone touched by this scandal, and she wants more than that.
Do you think there should be prosecution?
Yes, definitely, because the government knew. They just was pushing it under the carpet and hoping that we'd all die. Because somebody dies every 4 days, and sadly they've not been here to see the final chapter, where today is a day for us that's been affected and infected by this tragic, long, infected blood scandal, where it should have never, ever happened in the first place.
Greg Milam, Sky News.
Well, Sir Brian Langstaff's final report brings to a close decades of campaigning for recognition, but it raises deep, uncomfortable questions about the way that Britain was and still is governed. It lays bare decades of abuse, with patients repeatedly dismissed and let down, with key questions over the possibility of criminal prosecutions. Our science and technology editor, Tom Clark, is here with me now. Tom, you've been looking at the details. What stood out for you?
There's just so much. This is a huge report, 7 volumes, 2,500 pages. It covers 50 years of this disaster. But distill all that history down, there's a clear conclusion. This scandal was not an inevitability, and to a large degree, it was preventable. In his summary, the chair, Sir Brian Langstaff, finds, I have to report a catalogue of failures which caused this to happen. Each on its own was serious. Taken together, they're a calamity. And he goes on, I have to report that it could be, largely, though not entirely, have been avoided. And I have to report that it should have been. Why could it have been avoided? Well, one of the first conclusions that he makes is the Committee on Safety of Medicines, the body in the UK at the time and even now that's meant to stop products, to make sure medical products are safe, should never have licensed these imported American products that were infected with hepatitis C and then later HIV. And it finds the evidence available to the inquiry suggests that safety was not put first. Having considered all the available evidence, I ultimately have to conclude the decisions should not have been taken as they were. They certainly should not have been left to individual clinicians to take. So that risk was put on to individual doctors, and sure enough, they prescribed these medicines. Thousands of haemophiliacs were affected as a result. But, there's a parallel tragedy going on here that we haven't really talked about so much yet. Our own blood supply in the UK wasn't that safe either. Tens of thousands of people were infected with hepatitis C. There were many organisations and individuals who were found to have acted wrongly in all of this evidence. Many are now dead. But one name that does get mentioned a few times is Kenneth Clarke. Now, Lord Clarke, he was the health secretary at a crucial time in the 80s when all this was going on, when HIV first arrived. And the inquiry highlights his statement in Parliament. It was the government line at the time. There was no conclusive proof HIV was linked to these products and to blood. While technically correct, Sir Brian says, this was indefensible. It did not spell out the real risk. It gave false reassurance. And that was key. And he also highlighted the attitude of Ken Clarke when he gave evidence to the inquiry, saying that his inquiry, at times, his evidence was argumentative and unfairly dismissive. Have a listen to some of it.
Why do we have to go in such meticulous detail through who said what when, and when did he change his mind, and do you remember what actually persuaded you? You know, it was just frightfully interesting, no doubt, but pretty pointless.
Perhaps the most damning conclusion overall, though, is the evidence there was of a deliberate cover-up by successive governments. A clear example that evidence key documents may have been deliberately destroyed around the safety of the UK blood supply specifically. The evidence, Sir Brian says, is tentative. It's hard to put a clear blame on any individual, but in one section he states certainty is impossible, but it's an uncomfortable conclusion that it's more likely than not a civil servant chose to destroy the documents because they were those documents. He goes on to say that if this is right, it was a deliberate attempt to make the truth more difficult to reveal. So a big question, of course, for the survivors of this, for their families. Will we get prosecutions? Inquiries are prohibited from finding civil or criminal liability. The survivors say whether they proceed with legal action depends largely on how the government responds on things like compensation in response to this damning report.
Shocking on so many levels. Tom Clarke, thank you. Well, our political editor, Beth Rigby, is in Downing Street for us. And Beth, earlier today, we heard real contrition and apologies from across the political divide. But of course, apologies are important, so is action. What happens now?
Well, look, after decades of fighting, of suffering, of gaslighting, finally, tens of thousands of victims and those affected had their moment today where the suffering that they have gone through was laid bare in that report, and then in Parliament a Prime Minister standing up to apologise on behalf of successive governments. It was a truly historic day in which the scale of the scandal was laid bare and laid at the feet of a British state that had colossally failed its citizens. And the big question, of course, is what next? Well, beyond that apology, there was talk of a comprehensive compensation scheme. And today I've been told by a government source that in terms of what we might expect tomorrow, that scheme will meet the expectations and recommendations of Sir Brian Langstaff. I'm told it won't necessarily focus on the total amount of compensations in numbers, as the claims and variability of entitlement will be so wide for various victims, but there will be more interim payments and life-changing sums for many. We already know that there's been about 400 million of interim payments to 4,000 surviving victims. I'm expecting to see more settlements tomorrow. There's also a question of the government responding to some of the reforms that Sir Brian has laid out for the cultural changes required so that institutions don't ignore the little people, ignore victims in the way that has happened here and in other scandals such as the post office scandal or Hillsborough. And then also there's a question about prosecutions now, not at the moment within this jurisdiction, but I think those questions are only going to grow. Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Manchester, saying very clearly tonight that he felt there should be prosecutions.
Our political editor, Beth Rigby, with the latest there from Westminster. Beth, thank you. Now, in a surprise announcement, the chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court has applied for an arrest warrant for the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar. Karim Khan said he has enough evidence to believe that both men bear criminal responsibility for war crimes and crimes against humanity. President Biden has described the move to arrest Israel's leader as outrageous. Our Middle East correspondent Alistair Bunkle reports.
The charge sheet against Benjamin Netanyahu and his Defence Minister Yoav Gallant is scathing. To be accused of war crimes alongside some of Hamas's senior leaders is deeply humiliating for the two Israeli politicians. As well as Netanyahu and Gallant, the chief prosecutor is seeking arrest warrants for Hamas's leader in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, its military chief Mohammed Daif, and political head Ismail Haniyeh. All 5 men are accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity.
International law and the laws of armed conflict apply to everyone. No foot soldier, no commander, no civilian leader, no one can act with impunity. Nothing on earth can justify willfully depriving human beings, including women and children, babies, the old and the young, of the basic necessities required for life.
The charges mostly relate to the October the 7th terror attacks by Hamas and the Israeli response since. There is also reference, though, to illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank. The charges against the Israeli leaders also reference the humanitarian crisis inside Gaza and accuse Israel of deliberately withholding aid. Benjamin Netanyahu hit back at the charges.
The prosecutor's absurd charges against me and Israel's defense minister are merely an attempt to deny Israel the basic right of self-defense. And I assure you of one thing, this attempt will utterly fail.
A panel of judges at the ICC will now consider the request before deciding whether arrest warrants can be issued.
My guess is that these judges will have been presented with the evidence in an easily digestible form, and they will make their decisions pretty rapidly. I would think weeks, not months.
It's unclear how this might affect the war. Israeli forces have been pushing deeper into Rafah today and fighting in the north of Gaza. Netanyahu has vowed to keep fighting until Hamas is destroyed. He might choose to double down in defiance of the court. But he'll know that events today could put him in a small group that includes Vladimir Putin and Slobodan Milosevic. And that is a label that would remain with him for life. Alistair Bunkle, Sky News in Jerusalem.
Iran has declared 5 days of national mourning after its president, Ibrahim Raisi, died in a helicopter crash. He'd been traveling in a helicopter through bad weather in the northwest of the country. They were traveling back from a visit in Iran's East Azerbaijan province, crossing mountainous terrain in heavy fog. Our international correspondent Alex Rossi has more.
As Iranian commandos reached the crash site, it was clear that the failure of the helicopter in bad weather had been catastrophic. A reporter from Turkish television described the devastation.
This is where it broke apart, and here we even see it broken into many pieces, and it shows just how forceful it was.
The bodies of the victims, which included President Raisi and the foreign minister, were stretchered from the scene by emergency services. Ibrahim Raisi, who was elected 3 years ago, had been inaugurating a new dam on Iran's northwest border on the day of the disaster, meeting his counterpart from Azerbaijan. These images were filmed as he flew by helicopter earlier in the day, surveying the project. The deaths of 2 of the most important figures in the regime were announced by state media. The deceased president was declared a martyr for his service to the nation. Huge crowds of loyalists have been gathering at religious sites to mourn his passing. And in Tehran, his supporters expressed disbelief at what had happened.
Definitely he was a popular figure in our country, and he's not easy to replace. His absence will always be felt. But I hope people will elect a replacement who'll go down the same path as he did.
But President Raisi is not being mourned universally. Some let off fireworks in Iranian cities as news of the crash circulated. A clerical hardliner, his ruthless reputation had earned him the nickname the Butcher of Tehran for his role in sending thousands of Iranian prisoners of conscience to their deaths during the purge of 1988. He was also instrumental in the brutal crackdown of the women-led protests that erupted across the country. The younger generation also know him as a man with blood on his hands.
No one here is upset, and when a president dies and his people celebrate his death, it not only means he wasn't a good president, but was so abusive, everybody is happy that he's died.
President Raisi's demise, though, is unlikely to change the trajectory of the country. Ideological direction lies with the supreme leader, and he has vowed continuity. And as investigators work to establish the exact cause of the crash, this is an uncertain moment for Iran, with fears of instability before his successor is elected. Alex Rossi, Sky News.
And let's get more now from our international editor, Dominic Waghorn. Dominic, the Supreme Leader is vowing that there will be continuity. But how likely is it, do you think, that the president's death could lead to some instability in Iran?
I think there's always the possibility. I think the danger for the regime isn't in the immediate future, it's in the near to longer term future. In the near future, there is a script to follow. There'll be a funeral for Raisi tomorrow night. And then after that, elections will happen within 50 days. And we expect the Supreme Leader to find another hardline. There are plenty more where Raisi came from. And I think what's likely to happen is that he will be chosen and then it'll be arranged so there's no real effective opposition to him in the elections. I think that the only wrinkle in this for the regime is that Hassan Rouhani, the former president, has been writing letters and going public with his concerns about the way he's been barred from the body of experts who choose the Supreme Leader. So there are cracks emerging in the regime. And I think the problem for the government is not now, it's what happens in the future when Ayatollah Khamenei dies. Raisi was seen as a potential successor, but also a stabilising force for that very precarious moment, potentially, when Khamenei dies and a successor to the Supreme Leader, the ultimate authority in Iran, has to be chosen. With Raisi gone, I think that is a worrying loss for the Iranian government whenever that moment comes.
Our international editor, Dominic Waghorn, with the latest. Dominic, thank you. A nursery worker who strapped a baby girl face down onto a beanbag has been found guilty of manslaughter. 9-month-old Genevieve Meehan was tightly swaddled and covered with a blanket for more than 90 minutes by 37-year-old Kate Ruffley at a nursery in Stockport. Fraser Maud reports.
We long desperately to see her smile, to hear her laugh, and to feel her warm embrace.
A family devastated by the death of the daughter they loved in the care of the professionals they trusted. 9-month-old Genevieve Meehan, known as Gigi to her family, died after being swaddled in a blanket and strapped face down on a beanbag for an hour and a half at the Little Toes nursery in Cheadle Hulme. The woman responsible, Kate Ruffley, who prosecutors claimed had taken an inexplicable dislike to Gigi, which resulted in a palpable lack of care. The little girl was eventually found blue and unresponsive, her death caused by asphyxiation and pathophysiological stress.
I welcome the guilty verdict that has been found today, and I extend my gratitude to the jury who have seen and heard the facts of this case, which I have no doubt will stay with them for a long time.
We will never accept the cruelty of her life being taken away. She had her whole life to live and was loved so dearly by her family. Her life was full of promise and wonder, and it was taken. We will never forgive the callousness of Kate Ruffley's actions. She was entrusted with the care of our daughter, yet she put her own convenience and selfish interests above Genevieve's life.
It took the jury of 6 men and 6 women at Manchester Crown Court a day and a half to find Ruffley guilty of manslaughter. Kate Ruffley told the court that she didn't treat Gigi any differently to any other child at the nursery. And she went on to say that although she did feel responsible because Gigi was in her care at the time, she didn't feel that her actions were responsible for her death. Ruffley will now return to court on Wednesday to be sentenced for Gigi's manslaughter. Fraser Maud, Sky News, Manchester.
Julian Assange has been given permission to appeal against his extradition to the United States. It comes after his lawyers accepted the assurance that he would not face the death penalty. The WikiLeaks founder faces prosecution in the US over the publication of classified documents about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. People are being urged to report any sightings of Asian hornets this summer after a record number of sightings in the UK last year. Although Asian hornets pose no greater risk to human health than native hornets, they do threaten honeybees and insect pollinators. Speaking of flowers, the King and Queen have been touring the Chelsea Flower Show, viewing this year's displays before it opens to the public. They were joined by celebrities, including the stars of Bridgerton, at the event embracing sustainability. Drought-resilient plants, water storage and green innovation are among the highlights this year. Now, a device that sends an electrical buzz through the skin could allow people who were paralyzed several decades ago to regain movement in their arms and hands. A study followed 60 people with spinal injury and showed 90% had improvement in one measure of strength or function. Our science correspondent Thomas Moore has the story.
It would have been impossible for Melanie Reid to grip anything with her left hand until recently. She was paralysed in a riding accident 14 years ago, but movement and strength have begun to return since taking part in a clinical trial of a new electrical stimulator that helps to overcome the damage in her spinal cord.
Healthy people think that spinal injured people, all they want to do is to be able to walk again. But actually, if you break your neck, all you really want to do is be able to use your hands again, because that would make life so much easier.
The clinical trial was of a device called ARC-X, which fires strong electrical pulses into the spinal cord through electrodes on the neck. When the device was switched off, people with paralysis struggled with simple activities. But when it was switched on, 90% had clear improvements in their strength and muscle control.
Wow.
Scientists believe the electrical stimulation helped nerve signals from the brain to pass through the damaged spine to reach the muscles, and may even encourage new nerve fibres to grow.
Many participants show an immediate effect of the device. Their grip force may become twice as strong, even 7 times as strong when we turn the device on. And then there's this cumulative benefit as they practice doing rehabilitation with the device. They gradually become stronger, they gradually become more coordinated.
For some, the results are spectacular. John has picked up his guitar again and plays in a band. Melanie can put a ponytail in her hair. Even small gains in muscle control make a big difference to the quality of life for people living with paralysis. Thomas Moore, Sky News.
That's me.
Well, let's return now to the damning findings of the infected blood inquiry and hear from some of those affected who spoke out after Sir Brian Langstaff released his report today.
There was a deliberate attempt to lie and to conceal, and not just by one person either. This was systemic. This was by government, by civil servants and by healthcare professionals.
This is not only a cover-up, it's actually an abuse by many people who were set to supposedly care for us.
Throughout the report, Sir Brian refers to that line, the best treatment possible was given to people. And we now know once and for all that that was a lie.
We've been gaslit for generations. This report today brings an end to that, and it looks to the future as well, and says that this cannot continue.
Well, our health correspondent Ashish Joshi is here. Such powerful words there. You've been covering this story for years now, and you spent the whole day there at the inquiry. What are your reflections?
My reflections are what must be going through the thoughts of some of the families of people who have died needlessly. And Sir Brian Langstaff said as much today. This was a wholly avoidable scandal. These are some of the faces of the infected and affected, and I spoke to a lot of them today. And I think the only way you can describe today is a day of mixed emotions, the highs of vindication, being listened to at last, and the lows of knowing that your loved ones didn't need to die. But the fight isn't over. This might be the beginning of the end, and I think a lot of families tonight will be going to bed thinking, we've been listened to, but we have to carry on until those promises and pledges to remember what we've been through and the suffering we've endured are met.
Our health correspondent, Ashish Joshi. Ashish, thank you. Well, that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's papers in the press preview. Among the stories that we will be discussing, this on the front of the Metro about, of course, that report into the infected blood scandal. The headline, 40 years of bloody cover-up. We'll be right back. Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with Pippa Creer, political editor of The Guardian, and Theo Usherwood, political journalist and broadcaster. Welcome both. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's take a quick look at what is on some of those front pages. Unsurprisingly, one story is dominating. The damning inquiry report into the infected blood scandal leads the Daily Mail with this headline, "Day that shames the British state." This is the front of the Telegraph with an almost identical headline. The condemnation continues on the front of the Express. The Guardian now, and again, those words used in the Commons apology by Rishi Sunak, a day of shame. The Times too uses the same phrase, which has come to define the reaction to today's report into the scandal, and the Eye once more calling it a day of shame. The Metro describes it as 40 years of bloody cover-up. The Mirror says that it's time to make those who were guilty in the scandal face justice. Meanwhile, the Financial Times leads with the International Criminal Court calling for the arrest of Israel's Prime Minister and the leader of Hamas for alleged war crimes in the current conflict. And a reminder that, as always, by scanning the QR code that you see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us talk about them. And as I mentioned, we are joined tonight by Pippa Creer, political editor of The Guardian, and Theo Usherwood, political journalist and broadcaster. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I mean, obviously, there is just one story. It's on all the front pages. Let's just start with the Mirror front page. Headline there, infected blood scandal, and, you know, the pictures of, you know, just some of the, well, more than 3,000 people who've lost their lives. Pippa, your reaction to the report?
So what was really powerful to think about today was that, as the Prime Minister said, the focus should be on the families, on the victims and their loved ones, and remembering the 3,000 people who died, the 30,000 people who had been infected, and sort of, you know, leave the compensation and the politics and what comes next until tomorrow. And I think actually of all the front pages, the Mirror does this most strikingly with just some of those stories of people that died. And if I could just pick out one, the little boy in the bottom right of that front page, Colin Smith, who was born with haemophilia and was given factor VIII and by his medics, which, as we know now, was farmed from prisoners, drug addicts and sex workers in the States. He ended up being infected with HIV, and his parents didn't notice, or the medics didn't realise until he started dramatically losing weight. And of course, by that point, his condition deteriorated, and you know there was no coming back from it. He died when he was 7, but the trauma that the parents had to go through, not just losing their little boy, but the way that the reaction, bearing in mind it was the late 1980s, to the fact that their child developed AIDS. And, you know, they were known by some neighbours as the AIDS family. They had 6-foot letters written across their front door, AIDS dead, with crosses scraped on the door. And in the end, they decided to bring him home to die. Because that's where they felt safest, despite the fact that they had this you know, awful attacks because of the condition he had through no fault of his own. And that's just one story. But every single one of those people on the front page, and thousands more, will also have had similarly awful
we actually
stories.
had a report on that little boy, Colin Smith, on Sky, and his father said one thing that really stayed with me, that I don't think he used the word guilt, but he just had this, you know, he just felt awful that he had given his son, that effectively, you know, he, not knowing, had ended up giving his son what ended up killing him, you know, by going to the doctors and trusting. I mean, that's another word that comes up a lot, the trust that's been broken.
Yes, and I think it's very interesting that Sunak decided in his common statement to go down that line of blaming the doctors, blaming the medics and the NHS, reflecting what Sir Brian Langstaff had said in terms of that trust being broken. These were doctors who were entrusted with the care, in some cases of children, adults, to ensure that they could receive the right treatment, whether it be a blood transfusion or whatever. And instead of actually putting patients first, in some cases like that report you had from the Trelaws Special Needs School, they were using children without their consent or their parents' consent, effectively as guinea pigs, for their own experiments to find out which treatments work best. I mean, this is possibly one of the worst days in the NHS's history that I can ever remember, going back since its inception after the Second World War. I mean, I'm thinking about what happened in Mid-Staffordshire as well as being another horrific day for the NHS. And it's difficult to see now, you know, where does the NHS go from here in terms of rebuilding that trust with the British public? And that's not just a question for Mr Sunak, but it soon could be a question for Sir Keir Starmer as well, as he actually almost tried to, in his reply to Rishi Sunak, tried to, in effect, defend the NHS to some extent by saying actually politicians of all political hues had to accept some of the blame as well.
Let's take a look at some of the other front pages. So The Guardian, day of shame, deadly cover-up of blood scandal finally exposed. Of course, the cover-up compounding the pain of all the infected and affected. And then if we can just take a look at the Daily Mail as well. Front page there, day that shames the British state. Pippa, again, this word that keeps on coming up, shame.
Yes, because it wasn't just the terrible mistakes that were made by infecting so many innocent people and the impact it had on their lives. It was also, as Theo suggested, what happened next. And the fact that it was, as Brian Langstaff said today, this chilling is the word that he used, the Mail picks up here, cover-up that hid the truth for many years. There are examples both from the clinicians, from NHS leaders, and also from ministers, where individuals at all those three levels made public statements, made promises to patients and to the public about the state of play, which turned out not to be true. So, you know, suggesting, for example, that the blood which had been imported from the States had been I don't know the phrase for it, heat screened, so basically to remove any sort of virus that might be in it. They said that was happening, but it didn't happen, you know, for another couple of years, and that's because there wasn't the money there to do it. So it was this culture where, rather than sort of confronting this terrible disaster which had unfolded, there was a sort of like a let's all close in and try and protect ourselves, whether that's in the NHS, whether that's in the government, and that, you know, that is really a sort of the awful. Compounded the agony of all these families, that there wasn't sort of the responsibility taken for it sooner.
And I think the Mail's picked up on this to some extent by saying their fears that no one will ever face criminal justice for what has happened. And of course, these cover-ups serve a very pernicious purpose, and that is always to make it much more difficult to actually seek justice through the criminal courts for those responsible. Because if you're trying to prosecute somebody for something that happened 40 years ago in a historic case, when you have such a high threshold as for somebody to be proven guilty as beyond all reasonable doubt, it's very difficult to do when you're testing, what happened, trying to find out exactly what happened during a cross-examination of somebody trying to recollect or recall what happened such a long time ago. And now there are real fears from the families that after this cover-up, where they felt belittled, they felt lied to, they felt that the truth was being hidden from them. It wasn't just that. Actually, what we're probably going to see, and this is the real tragic consequence, and we saw it with Hillsborough as well, that actually it'll be very difficult now for those responsible to face justice in front of the courts.
Let me just bring up the front page of the Financial Times, which has a slightly different angle to it. Sunak promises whatever it costs to redress infected blood scandal misery. Of course, the Prime Minister issued a wholehearted, unequivocal apology, sounding very sincere in the House of Commons. Whatever it costs, it's about compensation at this point as well.
Yes, and we're expecting tomorrow to hear more from John Glenn, the Cabinet Office Minister, spelling out exactly what compensation the government will offer. Sunak here has promised to spend our money, obviously, whatever it costs to redress this. Whatever it costs seems to be in the region of about £10 billion, which is obviously a huge amount of money. But would have to be, given the constrained financial or economic circumstances in which the country is in, would be paid for by borrowing. And what's crucial, I think, is that Labour has said that they would, whatever process the government puts in place, because they want to do it sooner rather than later, they say, Labour has said that it would follow through. So the fact that it's got cross-party unity on this, it won't be sort of like political ding-dong of where the money comes from. But it does probably mean some choices for the Chancellor, because even if he's doing it via borrowing, and it's sort of, in accounting terms, it's been put as capital expenditure, it will mean potentially that there's less money available for, other choices that you might want to make going into the election, like tax rises and so on. So there has been a political choice there. And I think it's also worth quickly saying that while Rishi Sunak stood up there in the chamber today and said they'd spend whatever it costs, the Hull MP that had done a huge amounts of campaigning on this, made the point to him that there was an interim report in 2022 which recommended that compensation should be paid out. And they started, I think they paid out to 4,000 people, got £100,000 compensation. They started that process. But it didn't go as far as what was recommended. And the man who was Chancellor at that point was, and then obviously Prime Minister, was of course Rishi Sunak. So he could, and the point was made in the chamber and by Brian Langstaff, those payments could have come earlier. So there was even more pressure, I think, on the government now actually to deliver what it's promising.
Whatever it costs is almost the easy bit. It's about making sure that these payments are timely. And we've seen that from the post office scandal and what's happened there, that actually those who are affected, the victims who are affected, are not necessarily saying they want a particular amount of money or a sum of money. They're not greedy, they're not avaricious, and they want some sum of money that they think they deserve. They actually just want to receive that payment. They want to receive the justice that they so rightly deserve. And that's the question now. We're, looking ahead to what's announced tomorrow, and possibly, as Pippa said, the money's got to come from somewhere, whether that's more borrowing or some accountancy in an emergency budget. But it's just about how quickly that money now comes online for the victims, I think,
timing
as well.
is also key. Theo, Pippa, thank you so much for that. Now stay with us. Coming up, among the other stories that we'll be discussing, this on the front of the Telegraph, about Joe Biden condemning a decision by the International Criminal Court to seek the arrest of the Israeli Prime Minister. Its headline, US condemns ICC, calls for Netanyahu arrest warrant. We will be right back.
I'm Martin Brunt, and I'm Sky's crime correspondent. My most memorable story was, and still is, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann.
Please, please do not hurt her. Please give our little girl back.
We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news.
For detectives, the first 48 hours after a murder are crucial in the search for clues. The public expects them to find Jill Dando's killer soon. The British detectives are planning to meet forensic experts, academics, and even witch doctors.
I remember the grimmest case, the Soham murders of schoolgirls Holly and Jessica. I felt I can't undo what's happened, but I can help explain it.
Ian Huntley was arrested and charged within a fortnight of the murders.
I've never murdered anyone. I've never raped anyone. What am I in jail for?
The parole board has to decide if Bronson needs to be kept locked up for the safety of the public. My biggest challenge was to persuade a jailed diamond thief to answer my letters. Martin Brunt, Sky News at the Old Bailey.
Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me now. Pippa Creer, political editor of The Guardian, and Theo Usherwood, political journalist and broadcaster. OK, let's take a look at some of the other stories making the news in tomorrow's paper. Let's look at the Daily Telegraph. The US condemns ICC calls for Netanyahu arrest warrant. So the decision by the ICC to seek the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu for alleged war crimes, and not just him, and that's what the prosecutor is asking for, but also, I think, 3 leaders of Hamas, including Yahya Sinwar. Let me just bring you some breaking news that links into this story from the Reuters news agency. President Biden saying what's happening in Gaza is not genocide. Theo, what do you make of the Biden reaction or this call from the ICC anyway?
I think the Joe Biden reaction is actually he's being more hawkish towards the conflict in the Middle East than he has been previously. And listening to him, unequivocally say, as you reveal that breaking news, that it's not genocide what's happening in Gaza, is him taking a harder line in support of Israel, where actually in recent weeks and months, he's actually softened somewhat to take the White House has often been criticised by Israel for being more neutral than Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu would have liked. So I think that's interesting. I think also what's interesting is there seems to be something, although we were discussing this before, Pippa, of a split between what the British government's saying and Joe Biden. British government simply saying it's unhelpful, and actually what we should be focusing on in the Middle East is ensuring there's humanitarian aid can reach the civilians affected by the conflict, and ensuring the release of the hostages, rather than necessarily trying to draw equivalents, as Joe Biden has said, that the ICC is doing in terms of between what happened on October the 7th and Israel's reaction to Hamas.
Let me just quickly bring up the front page of the Times as well. Same story, and of course Netanyahu's fury at war crimes allegation. Pippa.
Well, of course, I think he's referring to 2 different things here. There's the International Criminal Court, which is focused on individuals that potentially are responsible for war crimes. And as the Times says here, on the Israeli side, these are crimes including starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, willful killing, and intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population in their response to the October 7th attacks. And then the separate issue of the International Court of Justice, where, as we know, South Africa has tried to take a case, or trying to get them to launch a case into whether Israel is responsible for genocide. So his remarks refer to that separate court procedure rather than to the ICC. But as Theo says, what's I think really interesting with the way that Biden has responded here is that it is much more, it's much less equivocal than he has been, and he's been very critical, particularly in recent weeks, over the potential of Israeli troops going into Rafah, where 1 million Palestinians are housed, even to the extent where he suggested that they would withdraw military support, some weapons, should the Israelis decide to do that. And then just as Theo mentioned, I think briefly it's worth us, from a UK perspective, looking at what at the Labour response to this, because potentially they're the next government in a few months' time. And it was very significant in the Commons today, David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, suggesting that the independence of the ICC must be respected.
We're going to have to leave it there. We'll talk about it at the top of the 11. Pippa Creer, Theo Usherwood, thank you. Coming up next on Sky News, a long-awaited public inquiry into the infected blood scandal sets out in damning detail decades of failure.